When you're evaluating different prospects for the draft and specifically quarterbacks, sometimes you have to take a leap of faith and sometimes a really, really big leap of faith because you don't get an incredibly large sample size. You don't have a lot to go off of. Sometimes you're dealing with prospects having these great traits and tools, but they're either raw or they're limited in their experience, or the college system that they played in a lot of times wasn't the best showcase for those talents and skills. That happens in every draft class, certainly happens this year, and I think one of those guys that we're going to have all types of questions about, have had questions about, will continue to have questions about until he gets to the NFL level and shows what he does, is Trey Lance. You're talking about this kid. He's only a redshirt sophomore technically from North Dakota State. So even just looking redshirt sophomore indicates not a ton of experience. When you also talk about the fact that not only does he not have a ton of experience, he only basically played one game in 2020 because his school canceled their football season. Like, that was potentially killer to his draft stock, or could have been the blessing in disguise because he didn't have another year to come back and expose himself more and either work on his flaws and get better, or have people get more tape on him where they start to talk themselves out of some of the projectable traits and skills that they see. You know, it can happen sometimes. And you talk about also in North Dakota State, so you're talking about him coming from a second level college in theory, even though North Dakota State certainly at that level is an absolute powerhouse. You're going to have some people that associate that school with Carson Wentz and say, oh, Carson Wentz was taken second overall and it looked like it was going to work out, and it ultimately didn't, and now he's in Indy. But again, it's very important to look at these quarterbacks and prospects in general based off of their skills and their talents and how they project to the next level. And I got to say, when you talk about Trey Lance, he's got plenty of skills and traits that project to the next level. Like in terms of pure physical upside, when I'm grading him and I just look at the upside and I look at the skills that I see, you know, the most, let me rephrase this. When you talk about highest ceilings of quarterbacks in this class, the quarterback with the absolute highest ceiling in this draft class is not Zach Wilson, it's not Justin Fields, it's not Mac Jones, it's not Trevor Lawrence, it's Trey Lance. Because when you look at what he brings to the table, you say if you get the absolute best out of him, he'll be better than anybody else in this class. Now, that's a big ask. That could be a big if, but if you do, man, it can certainly be something because he's got the size. He's got that kind of prototype size that you like to see well put together, so you assume he's going to be able to handle the rigors of a 16-game NFL season. He's got an absolute fire hose for a right arm. You know, he will have no problem making all of the required throws at the NFL level from a velocity standpoint. Throws a beautiful deep ball. He's a guy that you look at, he can fit the ball into really, really, really tight throwing windows. He can absolutely make some spectacular, rare, elite level type of throws that very few guys in the NFL, even some of the big name, borderline elite or elite quarterbacks in the league, cannot make. He can make them. He's a really good athlete, so you're talking about a guy that has the ability to break games open with his feet. You're talking about a guy that can scramble, that can move around, that can extend plays, that can pick up yards, pick up first downs, making him even more difficult and challenging for opposing defenses at the NFL level to defend against. You look at some of these physical traits, just pure physical traits, and you say, you know what, you like a lot of what you see here. You could say in some cases his ball placement needs a little bit of work, but I also saw some beautiful ball placement on a lot of back shoulder throws, fades, you know, being able to hit receivers on slants and crossing patterns in stride as opposed to having them reaching around all over the place and having to use their catch radius to pull it in. You know, accuracy versus ball placement. The ball placement, I was impressed with what I saw out of him in 2019, even though, again, you're talking about 1 year, but it was also his first full year as a starter. He was only a redshirt freshman then, for Christ's sakes. I liked his decision-making. I would like to see him speed up the processor just a little bit. But again, it's a tricky eval when you're talking about him playing at North Dakota State because you're talking about a guy that doesn't face the best defenses, doesn't face the best coverages. So you might not always be able to most appropriately flush some of these things out and be able to see just how good his decision-making is on a consistent basis. When he's under duress, I would say sometimes he's a little quick to bail from the pocket. He hangs tough in the pocket, and I like some of the feel that he demonstrated in the pocket his ability to move within the pocket to extend the play without always having to bail out. When you think about it from a decision-making kind of process, there were a lot of times where he was one read and run. And sometimes it was one read, he would wait, and he's gone. And you would like to see him be patient a little bit and wait for things to develop, because not everything's going to develop at that speed when you get to the next level. So that's something that he's going to have to work on a little bit, but it's still, you're talking about a guy that could be such a good runner, it's not always the worst thing. Like, there might be less risk associated with him running 10 yards for a first down as opposed to trying to throw that 10-yard hook pattern or that 10-yard comeback. Durable, didn't really see any major concerns with him in terms of injury. I will say that you're talking about a quarterback that's played in all types of looks, whether that's more traditional shotgun or pistol or under center. It's one of the benefits of these guys that come from North Dakota State. They play in that system that utilizes him in all those different formations and all those different sets. So you're not necessarily having to teach him how to take the ball from under center. You've got the ability to kind of roll with him in that way. I think the biggest thing that I look at with Trey Lance, I say his accuracy does need to get a little better. Sometimes when you talk about some of the short and intermediate throws, he doesn't always need to throw a laser in there. Sometimes taking a little bit off, putting a little more finesse on it would certainly make the ball more catchable for his receivers, because he had some drops that I think were due to throwing the ball too hard, which I like that. I'd rather have a guy that throws it too hard and you ask him to back off a little bit than a guy that can't get it there and you're asking him to throw even harder, because then the accuracy goes all over the place. Like, to me, as you look at some of these other things, and you could say, well, in this 2020 game against Central Arkansas, it was one game. It was one game. Like, when I look at him from a decision-making standpoint, I would say in 2019 we could hype up the fact that he didn't have any interceptions. I actually would have preferred if he did have a few, because I want him with that arm talent and that ability to make some big-time NFL throws. I want him to take a few more chances. I want him to take a few more calculated risks, because that potential and that upside is there. But mechanically, he needs work. He has some length to his release that I would like to see him shortened up a little bit. But I think the biggest thing, and you probably saw recently, like Dan Orlovsky said something on ESPN about this, and it was on Twitter, and he was comparing him to Mitchell Trubisky and saying it was his fatal flaw. Well, number one, mechanics were not Trubisky's fatal flaw. They were a big flaw of his, but not the fatal flaw. It was the inability to process and react to what he saw on the field. That was his fatal flaw. And then combining that with his fear the last 2 years of not wanting to run the football, like, those were more fatal flaws than the pure mechanics. The mechanics and some of the challenges of Trubisky not getting squared up, not throwing off of his front foot, throwing too much off of his back foot, not utilizing his lower body properly in the throwing motion. When he would plant at the end of his drop, he puts his leg too far back. Like, those are flaws, but they weren't the fatal flaw. But for Trey Lance, it could potentially be the fatal flaw. Because when you talk about a guy who has a little bit of a slow release, who isn't quite as quick as, let's say, a Wilson or somebody like that, or a Mac Jones in this draft class in terms of processing what he sees, like, you need to be able to shorten up that time a little bit. And what concerns me with Lance is when you think about when he's dropping back in his motion, he sets at a really wide base, he puts his trail leg back really far, and then what that happens is that leads to the little crow hop and having to adjust and right himself, and all that's doing is killing time. All you're doing is burning time when you're having to do that. Now you can say, well, he fixed that because you saw his pro day and he didn't have that there. Fair enough. But is a pro day a scripted, choreographed workout the same as live in-game action? Like, how are those mechanics going to hold up when he's actually playing live games, when he's playing against NFL defenses bearing down on him? You can sometimes default to those bad habits until you work those bad habits out of you. Now, for him, luckily enough, at North Dakota State, he had such great arm talent, he had such great zip and velocity on the ball that he could get away with some of the funky mechanics. He could get away with the bad footwork. He could get away with the length in his release. But he is going to have to tighten that up. Because if he doesn't tighten that up, even with that arm strength, he's going to think he can fit it into windows that he's not going to be able to fit it into. What's scary about it, though, is if he does fix himself mechanically even a little bit, like, you're going to get even more out of that arm. He's going to be more accurate. As you think about it, too, sometimes, like, you drop down when your feet are like that, it's a lot harder to get through. I know these graphics are horrible. It's just my fingers at this point. But, imagine this is your back leg. Like, you want to be able to fire that through as you're throwing the football. And with him, it's a lot harder to do that because he was starting from such a base. He'd have to collect and gather himself, utilizing a couple hops again, burning time all the while. When I look at him mechanically, if you can work through some of that, it's going to improve his accuracy a little bit. It's going to mean that he's going to be able to more quickly read, diagnose, react to what he sees because he's not gathering himself so much. It means that he's going to be able to a little more easily avoid some contact in the pocket, allow him to maneuver a little more efficiently and effectively within the pocket. Like for him in this case, I would agree with Dan Orlovsky's statement that it is the fatal flaw. Because when you look at a lot of these other things in his game, like he has the tools. He absolutely has the tools. You might have some concerns about the decision-making, the field vision, the processing and recognition. Like I said, there's a big difference between him being maybe a little bit slow, but some of that could be caused by mechanics, versus a Justin Fields who is really, 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 really slow. Like that will take a lot more work to get it out of him. When I look at Trey Lance, like arguably to me, graded out as the number one quarterback in this draft. And when I see him, I see Josh Allen. You might have some people who can maybe compare him to somebody like a Cam Newton. I think that's a terrible comparison. Cam Newton was a generational type of runner at the quarterback position, but in a different way. It wasn't like dynamic and just make people miss, etc. But he was a house. You know what I mean? Like Cam was truly special as a runner. I think Lance is really good as a runner, but he's not electric, let's say, in the way that Cam Newton is. I think his arm strength is similar to Cam Newton, but the big difference is he is far more sophisticated as a passer than Cam Newton was coming out of Auburn. Now, what happened with Cam Newton at Auburn, sometimes people get so caught up in the running ability and some of the basic throws that he missed that they missed some of the truly special big-time NFL throws that he could make. Well, I see some of those same type of traits in Trey Lance, but on a whole different level, which again brings me to Josh Allen, a guy that there's a big physical presence at the position that can make plays happen with his feet, but can absolutely throw lasers across the field. He's a guy that can sit there and make those big-time special NFL throws, and maybe even if you have a concern with he missed a throw here or there that he should have gotten. Again, this comes down to when you talk about completion percentage and things like that. That's not the ultimate measurement of accuracy. And to me, I would rather see a guy, miss one every once in a while, but he can hit that key play, 20 yards down the field in that gap in the cover two and hit it on a perfect rope or hit it with perfect ball placement. Or the guy that's able to throw with some anticipation and put it on a rope over the middle of the field, as opposed to the guy that can dink and dunk and have a high completion percentage throwing 5 yards or less away from the line of scrimmage. Like, a lot of guys can do that. Even a lot of guys in college now can do that. That's not special. What Trey Lance has is special. And when I look at the San Francisco 49ers and now them trading up to the 3rd overall pick, unless the Jets are historically stupid in taking somebody else that's not a quarterback or they take the wrong quarterback, you assume Trevor's gone 1, Zach's gone 2. Like, they moved up for a quarterback. For my money, it's either him, talking about Trey Lance, or they see Matt Ryan traits and Mac Jones and they're taking him. But I got to tell you right now, like, I think Mac Jones is a really good prospect and he'll be my next scouting report. And I'll talk about him. And I agree with some of the Matt Ryan comparisons. But when I look at him, like, I see Josh Allen. And it might take you a little bit to get it out of him. Like, it might take 2 to 3 years to fully get it out of him, just like it did for the Bills. But holy Christ, when he got it out of him, he got damn near MVP level play with much more upside to go. You've got this young quarterback that even bet on himself coming out of high school where teams wanted him to play different positions. He said, no, I'm going to go here and I'm going to play quarterback. And look what the hell he did. Yeah, for my money, Trey Lance is QB2 in this draft behind Zach Wilson. He has the ability, Trey Lance does, if he maximizes his potential, he can easily be QB1 in this draft. And if that's who the 49ers take, then by God, they're going to absolutely love what they've got there in San Fran the next 12, 15 years. He might take a little bit of time for you to fully realize that potential, but I think he's absolutely overflowing with it. And I'd be stunned if he doesn't ultimately pan out in a big way at the NFL level.